All right, thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. I'm Luca Bertoletti. I'm European Sales Manager for the Consumer Choice Center. And today at our weekly webinar, our director, Fred Roder, will interview Daniel Lacalle, one of the leading economists of the world. He was among the top 20s in, I think a couple of years ago, he was in a ranking among the top 20s influential economists. He's lecturer at the London School of Economics, and he works for very different association, and he also managing a fund right now, if I'm not mistaken. And I will say we start immediately, as we are already a bit late on the table. So Fred, the floor is yours. Thanks, Daniel, for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Luca. Also, welcome everyone to our weekly Consumer Choice Center webinar. We are really excited to have Daniel Akai with us today. And it's a hot day in many parts of Europe, so I hope your computers and devices will survive these roughly 45 minutes where we're excited to see Daniel's views on the global economy, the chaotic year of 2020, and policy responses. So as Luca already said, Daniel is an economist, has worked across the globe, not just as an economist, but also actually in business, with a strong focus on energy, oil and gas markets, but in general also investment advisement. And what we really love to discuss with Daniel, who has also been actually ranked as one of the top 8 economists of the world. Wow, what a pleasure to have you here, Daniel. You just published a new book called Freedom or Equality, and your book talks a lot about ideas out there in the public policy sphere, which are being discussed right now a lot because we have been using the word unprecedented in inflationary way, and therefore there are also so many policy proposals out there who discuss or aim to get us out of this recession and out of this COVID disaster. And while you also spend a lot of your individual and private time advocating and informing policymakers and regulators on how to do better policies, we would just like to discuss with you what your new book is about. And for us as the Consumer Choice Center, as a global consumer advocacy group, we're of course also always interested in seeing what policies are good for consumers, how does it affect their purchase power and their choice to buy products and services. So Daniel, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great time to be talking about all these things, because although the book Freedom or Equality was not written in the COVID era, even thinking about the possibility of a pandemic, it does touch upon all those things that we're hearing constantly in the media and in the public debate about what should be done in terms of addressing the challenges of the economy. We hear constantly that what we need to get is a lot more government spending. We need a lot more money printing, that the idealistic view about a free market world cannot be addressed, cannot address the issues that we're facing right now. And what this book tries to do is to debunk all those myths, debunk the myths about the need for massive government spending or the need of massive money printing as well. And also to give realistic solutions to the challenges of healthcare, education, environment, and through a development of the capitalist society that we're living, acknowledging all that has been achieved, but developing into the new opportunities that come from those challenges.
Interesting. So let's dive into some topics. Your book is very extensive. It's hundreds of pages. We cannot discuss all of it yet, but I picked a couple of topics which I think could be really interesting to our audience today. We have some people here in Zoom directly, which will also ask some questions afterwards. But then also people we're streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So we have many more people following this webinar right now through the social media channels. We'll also collect questions there. So please, everyone, feel free to send us questions and we'll take some of these and give Daniel a chance to respond to this. While you've written your book in the pre-COVID area, I mean, this is something no one anticipated to happen, or at least not many people. There was already a discussion in many countries, especially in the Nordic countries, to reform our welfare state and follow a model where we say, okay, we just kind of combine all these individual subsidies to welfare recipients or people in need, and just create some sort of universal basic income. I believe countries like Finland and Denmark, to a lesser extent, have even tried this. Now, we're like in summer 2020, and millions of people, if not even tens of millions of people across the world are on furloughing schemes. Especially people in the service industry, bartenders, flight attendants, you name it. Wouldn't it be smarter for us just to have a universal basic income where we just say, okay, even if something like COVID would happen, everyone is covered with at least €1,000 or something like this a month, and they can just like use this time they're not working to learn more and educate themselves to work, become, for instance, an IT engineer, which is currently much more highly sought than a bartender. What would you say to an idea like this?
Well, it certainly looks interesting to think that if we had universal basic income and there's a crisis, then people would not find themselves in a dire situation. The problem is to understand where those €1,000 would come from. And if you start from the premise of having that universal basic income, you have to understand as well that it will be paid by constantly diminishing the purchasing power of the currency by printing money. Therefore, what ends up happening is that you give up, just in case there is a crisis, you give up a constant reduction in the real wages and in the purchasing power of the currency in order to address a short-term situation. The crisis of COVID-19 has not been created by excess, has not been created by misallocation of capital from the private sector. It's because of the government-forced shutdown. So the idea that the mistakes of a government are going to be solved by giving even more power to the government seems ludicrous to me. But again, I come back to the point of what universal basic income is. Universal basic income ends up being a subterfuge by which you are creating a substandard and zombie class that is always dependent on the money that is given to them via printing money. So in essence, universal basic income doesn't work as an incentive to work, certainly, and it doesn't work as an improvement in terms of poverty, etc. Because even in the most let's say benign calculation of where the money would come from, we all know that it would come from massively printing money, and that does not generate any incentive. Think about it. If we had universal basic income before the COVID-19 crisis, the two things would have happened. First, the level of unemployment and the level of the percentage of people that simply decide not to work would be much higher before the crisis. And then with the crisis, what we would see is that the purchasing power of those €1,000 that today to you and to me seem like an acceptable figure. Why? Because there's no inflation, or there's very little inflation. But if you decided to constantly increase money supply by the amount needed to give universal basic income, what you would be today and before the COVID-19 crisis talking about would be more Argentina and a lot less Europe.
Yes, and I mean, you wrote in your book, Freedom or Equality, about universal basic income, and probably something you can also see in countries that have something close to UBI. The low-level service industries are usually rarely represented. It's pretty expensive to have a cleaning lady or a taxi driver or Uber driver in Nordic countries, because such massive welfare transfers that come basically without any requirements or with any strings attached destroy people's incentive to enter the labor market at a low hourly wage. right? And then if you see the comparison, countries like in Southeast Asia, like Singapore or Hong Kong, you have lots of prosperity, but you also have aspiring people working in low-income areas, which create actually more opportunities for people and for consumers, also the ability to actually purchase something like hiring someone to drive you for an hour, or getting a haircut, or getting your nails done, which in some economies, like try to get your nails done in Norway, right? That probably costs more than an intercontinental flight. I don't know, but so that's definitely interesting. And you already mentioned governments have to print money. Yep. No, go ahead.
No, it's a very good point what you just mentioned, which is how it transfers inefficiencies of the pricing system into the entire society. So actually, what ends up happening is that the most disfavored people are actually displaced from the economy much more than in another environment. So yes, what I'm trying to say is that yes, you do get 1,000 euros, fine, but when you go to pay something with those 1,000 euros, you find that the purchasing power of that is very, very poor. But if you look at other economies, and I'm, as you know, Spanish, and think about Spain, think about Italy, think about Greece, Portugal, so many countries in which there is
So just bear with us for a bit. We're experiencing some connectivity problems, but Daniel should be back in a second.
Yes, sorry, I don't know what happened. What I was
We got you back.
You see me now? No, what I was saying is that I have a friend that says that universal basic income is so bad that it didn't even work in Finland. Says it all.
Great. You might want to flip your phone by 90 degrees. And then we have you fully back. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So you mentioned already the money supply and governments printing money to even afford these things. And I know you're very passionate and out there talking about monetary policy. And I don't want to go too deep into monetary policy because we look more at consumer-based policies, while of course printing money impacts consumers' purchase power. And it's important to keep in mind that inflation is the enemy of consumers that saved and want to spend at some point some money. We would love to look a bit, okay, what happens in the last crisis, 2008, 2009. Governments started printing a lot of money, but they also started increasing consumption taxes quite a bit, right? I mean, 15 years ago in Europe, talking about VAT rates between 20 and 25% was rather unusual. And then in our current country of residency, the United Kingdom, the government first cut the VAT from 17.5% to 15%, just to bring it later on to 20%, which is a massive increase. I mean, you take 5 additional % away from consumers, which is a massive tax, especially a regressive tax, right? I mean, low-income households pay a much bigger percentage on VAT compared to middle or high-income households that actually save and don't pay VAT that much, at least in a relative term. So what is your projection? Like, what will governments try to do now to pay for these trillion and quadrillion bailouts and stimuli packages they are launching?
I'm afraid that we will see a double whammy of indirect and direct taxes. This time around, the governments are going to invent new and creative words to call the new taxes. They will call them special taxes. They will call them COVID-19 taxes. They will call them green taxes. But they will be indirect taxes, just that, like VAT. You cannot raise VAT today easily because people get very angry. As you very well know, we have seen protests all over the Eurozone, etc. But social, that kind of thing. So you will see a big increase in indirect taxes because they know that those are the ones that have the highest collection power. And you will also see an increase in taxes on wealth and taxes on savings.
That sounds not good for consumers. So Daniel, if you would be special advisor to the Spanish government, whichever government they currently have, because it changes regularly, and Downing 10 in London, what would be your advice how a government should approach the current situation? Because obviously we have lockdowns which accelerate companies to go bankrupt. No matter what you think about the lockdowns, I mean, there are arguments in favor and against them, but we have this economic damage that has already happened. So what should governments do now to pave the best way out of this recession?
Which is to put in place all of the measures that they know drive growth and forget about deficits for a while. They cannot think now about increasing taxes to collect $1 billion, maybe $2 billion or €1 billion that will not even mildly address the deficits that they are incurring into. So the only way that we get out of this crisis is by spurring growth. And it has to be with supply-side measures. They have to implement tax cuts so that the companies that want to invest in our countries do so with all of the security and all of the attractiveness that they can. Introduce all the positive measures to increase employment at any cost, lowering, for example, wage taxes, I think is very, very important. All those things will have to be done, and understand that, yes, we have for a while a level of deficit and a level of debt that is going to be astronomical. But you need to bring growth before you even think of putting taxes on savings and putting taxes that are going to hinder growth. Because the worst thing that could happen, which is, I don't know if you've been able to see, but the IMF just slashed its growth estimates for 2020 and 2021, and the IMF, like the OECD or other supranational entities, are not particularly pessimistic when they do estimates. So what we need to do is to think, okay, we have this phenomenal fiscal space that is going to be financed by expansionary monetary policy. That is fine. Okay, we already have that, but let's make the most out of it. What can we do to make the most out of it? What we need to do is to get the maximum number of jobs that have been lost back in the economy, and any company that has the wildest idea about investing, please come here and invest. That's what they need to do. Any other measure is going to be counterproductive for growth and completely inefficient in terms of deficit reduction. So if they massively increase taxes, as I mentioned before, consumption will be lower, investment will be lower, the level of growth will be lower. And on top of that, the tiny amount of money that they're going to collect will be negligible in terms of debt to GDP reduction.
So that's interesting. I mean, probably part of that is also this massive deregulation of permits, licenses. If you want to set up a pub somewhere in England or in Spain, usually probably you have to comply with a lot of laws, and this is probably right now not needed because many will go out of business. So we need new people who set up these similar businesses and offer these services to people.
Certainly, for example, in the southern part of the European Union, it takes about 3 years to get a permit to start a business. 3 years in many cases. But in the average of the European Union, it takes a minimum of 3 months. 3 months. I mean, obviously, for a bureaucrat, 3 months might not be a lot of time. But think about somebody that's starting a business and is paying rent and salaries and costs, different costs all the time.
Absolutely. So maybe we talk a bit about corporate welfare, because that's something, cronyism and corporate welfare is something you also mentioned in your book, freedom or equality. And often it's perceived that governments handing out big checks paid by taxpayers to large businesses, that's capitalism. And a lot of people criticize capitalism, see that as one of capitalism's fault. How would you respond to such a conception of capitalism, that it's basically just governments writing checks to the big companies on the expense of taxpayers and small business?
Yes, it's a very good question, because that has nothing to do with capitalism and everything to do with statism, which is the system by which the government surrounds itself with a few companies that are so-called strategic or so-called close to the government. Those companies do receive some level of support, but, and this is the key and most important part, is that they do receive some support, but they're not companies that are doing well or making tremendous lots of money. They're actually companies that are barely surviving. They're zombie companies, most of them. So the interesting thing about that is that, first, it is not a trait of capitalism, but of statism. But the other thing, and I think it's more, can even work, because those companies are left to survive, but they're not growing or generating better margins. They're not even hiring more people. And this zombification of the corporate structure is something that is very dangerous, because it comes fundamentally from that perception of governments wanting to keep companies at any cost, at the expense of all of the other businesses that could actually deliver higher productivity and better job creation. Those national champions that anybody that is watching us right now knows. And when you think of companies that actually have not been growing, constantly giving poor returns, they even do badly in the stock market. Those are zombified companies, and we're seeing it now, for example, with the completely incorrect decision of the German government about Lufthansa. Is that what they're doing is to inject capital into a company to prevent the company from restructuring and getting healthier. This is unbelievable, because the tab is paid by consumers and is paid by the high productivity sectors. No? So that is extremely, has absolutely nothing to do with capitalism and everything to do with statism.
That's really interesting what you say. If you look at Lufthansa, I mean, the money the German government put in was more or less the market cap of the company at that point, but they only got 20 or 25% of the equity, which is also just a terrible investment. I mean, their market cap was just like, it didn't justify the shares they get. So it's also just a really bad deal for taxpayers, even if you think governments should buy stocks of businesses. And obviously, as a shareholder, you should also not be in favor of keeping the company less competitive by making deals with the union. So we discussed this today in one of our meetings at the Consumer Choice Center. We have like a daily meeting where we discuss some policy issues we should work more on, represent consumers. And one thing we're very passionate about is the airline industry right now, because consumers bought tickets. Many airlines do not honor the reservations, which makes sense. They're not flying because there's not enough demand, or maybe even they're not allowed to fly passengers to certain countries. But then governments are bailing out these businesses, and at the same time, these businesses are not refunding passengers for tickets. And I mean, I have, for instance, an example. I bought an Air France ticket. The flight is not happening. Air France refuses to give me my cash back. They only offer a voucher. Air France, KLM got bailed out by their governments. I do have a private insurance against their bankruptcy. So I actually don't mind if they go bankrupt. My insurance would pay. But they would put in this, as you call it, like zombie limbo, or this like artificial state where they get a bailout, they are not allowed to go bankrupt, and they're not paying their customer, or they're paying customers back who didn't receive any service, which is basically, that's basically the big companies with the good connections get like all the benefits, and consumers are getting, pardon my French, screwed over this. We're just catching up with some lag. Hey, Daniel, I think we have you back.
Yeah, sorry about that again. I'm really sorry about the connection today. It's very strange. No, what I was saying is that how important it is, what you just mentioned, is that when you have a system in which what the government is doing is not actually bailing out these companies. What they're actually doing is zombifying. That's why you said, well, they're getting a lot of money. Why are they not refunding me? Because they're not even allowing these companies to get better. There can be ways of supporting the airline industry. Nobody disagrees with the fact that there might be a need to support the airline industry. What it should not be is an incentive to make these companies less efficient. An airline company in itself is a company that must and does adapt to very difficult environments constantly. Increases in oil prices, changes in legislation, etc. So when governments come in and put money into these companies, they're not doing it for the benefit of consumers. They're doing it for the benefit of governments. They politicize these companies, and therefore their ability to adapt to challenging environments is reduced, because the first and foremost incentive that governments impose into these companies is to not reduce prices, is to not pay for some of the money that is owed to their clients, and furthermore, that they don't undertake the efficiency measures that they should actually implement.
Yes, and I mean, one example is just last year we ran a campaign against these additional taxes on passengers, these environment taxes for departure fees, which are like advocated by many European member states. And the UK has a really high passenger departure fee. And Switzerland just increased its taxes on passengers at the same time that bail out or co-bail out Swiss Air. Which is just bizarre, right? So instead of just saying, this industry needs some more competitive advantage because this year didn't go well for global aviation travel, how about we just cut the taxes for the customers so it's more affordable to buy a plane ticket? No, we increase the taxes, but we also give out these very selective handouts, and that's only to those companies we like, right? I mean, it's just like a very unjust system instead of just letting consumers decide which mode of transportation and which company they want to use.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, governments, and not because they're evil, or it's because their objective is not to manage situations and to adapt to challenging situations. Their objective is to maximize the budget. So governments are always going to be much worse than the private sector at picking winners, but they're even much worse than any other at allowing losers to just become obsolete and allow other companies to get better. So it's not just you see the point here is that it's not just that you're extremely bad at deciding who is going to win in a competitive environment is that you're even worse at deciding when a company that is obsolete or that is not efficient should simply just pass the flag to somebody else that does it better. That in itself is not because governments are evil, again, or because they don't understand. It's because it's not their job. It is not our job either. If we decided it, if we got together all the people that were here in this wonderful webinar, got into a committee to decide winners and losers, we would be wrong as well. Because our objective, like anybody can understand, would be to maintain the status quo, not to improve the competitive landscape for the economy.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of questions. I just want to go into these, and then maybe we have some more discussion points coming from this. So we already talked about universal basic income, and my colleague Bill actually has a question regarding this. So imagine there's a boxing match between universal basic income and corporate welfare checks. For which of the two boxes would you root for? Would it be corporate welfare or UBI?
It's a great question. Why do I have to choose between one or the other? And it's a very good question, because both are atrocious, no? And I don't think that that is the solution. I would say I'm going to cheat the question, and I'm going to say that I would be in favor of a negative tax, so that would help. That would do the same positive effect that many adhere to the universal basic income that it doesn't have, whilst not generating the perverse incentives. So I would say a negative tax on labor.
So you would have it with Milton Friedman there?
Yeah, a little bit of that.
Okay, and then we have a second question, another question from Maria. It's about lockdowns and the economic impact of lockdowns to our economies. So she says that you said the crisis was caused by the government decision to impose the lockdown, but she asked, isn't it more like the virus itself to blame? Because even if there was no lockdown, people would still be afraid to go to cinemas, cafes, especially in the start, and demand would fall away.
Yeah, no, she's absolutely right. The difference is probably 5-6 points of GDP only. Huh? You see what I mean? Is that the idea that you have to choose between lives or the economy is a complete farcical idea. The idea that you have to choose between lives or the economy is wrong. You have to choose with lives and the economy. And there is an example, to Maria's point, that you've seen South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Austria, Switzerland, countries that have not implemented such aggressive and wrongly analyzed and misguided lockdowns as, for example, Spain or Italy. And they're going to, yes, they are going to suffer in their GDP. Absolutely, they will, but in a proportion that is absolutely negligible and that is perfectly acceptable for the economy, is what I'm saying. So the point to Maria's question is absolutely there would be a crisis. Absolutely. No one is questioning that there would be a crisis. The question is the severity of the crisis. And the government-enforced lockdown was conducted because governments prior to that decided to ignore the signals that were coming from the countries that were closest to China. Because if all of us in the European Union, in the UK, in the United States had actually followed the protocols of Korea, of Singapore, of Taiwan, etc., we would actually not be talking today about a downgrade of another 50% of GDP estimates in the global economy. We would be talking, yes, of a crisis that would be manageable and that would definitely not have the amount of unemployment that we are seeing right now.
That makes sense. I mean, there's a lot about decentralization. You can see South Korea, or also Germany, for instance, with a very decentralized private laboratory testing system, where it was just very easy and quick to scale up infrastructure to widely test. And then the UK with a very centralized system, and it took them basically till May to test even their own medical staff of the NHS widely, right? I mean, this is just like the failure of centralization, which would probably cost a couple of % of GDP, which is billions and billions in these large economies, and hundreds of thousands of jobs at least.
Certainly.
Probably cost a couple of % of GDP, which on July 4th, it sounds now that we will have our UK Independence Day, or English and Wales Independence Day. So on July 4th, the day I was in the UK. But obviously, this new rules will also mandate businesses to enforce very strict distancing rules, and it will be harder to serve many customers at once. So just today, I read that many businesses and shopping malls, tenants in shopping malls or pubs and restaurants are trying to renegotiate their leases, because they say, well, you know, we can just not have as many customers as before that. So our profitability is totally different. So we cannot pay so and so much as lease, and on top of that, business rates, which are also like very high taxes for de facto taxes for businesses. How long will it take to get out of this and just go back to normal business?
It'll take a while. It'll take a while. It is estimated that it takes about between 6 to 8 weeks to close the economy entirely, and it takes about between 4 to 10 times that to recover to normal. That is estimates of Deutsche Bank. Okay, very challenging. It'll take time. I think that the difference of an economy like the UK and the United States with the Southern European ones, with France, is that it's a much more dynamic economy, and that those systems of adjustment are quicker. And therefore, I believe that the UK and the United States will recover faster than those 4 to 8 times that we were talking about, and it's already evident in some figures.
So that's good news. And right now in the UK, they're discussing to reduce the VAT at least for some time, for 6 to 12 months. Something Germany has already decided by 3 percentage points. So that it might also just boost some consumer confidence, make people buy even more kitchen equipment. I'm not sure how much kitchen equipment I bought in the last 4 months, but I don't know, garden equipment and these things. But there's another question coming, and that's a bit related to our topic right now. The question is pretty short. The question was just, should we reevaluate our relationship with China? Probably I would just put it in the context of virus came from China, which, I mean, has to come from somewhere, right? But probably the information coming out of China informing the world community on this was problematic. I just read a couple of days ago that the Italian Institute for something health found out water samples from December in Italy, which already contained the virus. So apparently the virus was already in Europe in December and didn't just emerge in late December in Wuhan, as maybe some officials in Beijing want to tell the world. So do you think China has some responsibility towards this global mess and our delayed response to everything?
I certainly think that when this is over, we need to have a serious analysis of the timing and the information on the pandemic, and taken independently and analyze it independently, because you know, it doesn't make any sense to believe that everything happened at some point at the end of January, and that I remember talking about this here at the office, that they were closing a city that has tens of millions of citizens because 100 people died. You see what I mean? Is that there were contradictory messages already when China closed about 40% of the GDP of the country in different regions because of 1,000 dead. You know how many 1,000 people die every day in China? So I think that there needs to be a re-evaluation of how international bodies like the World Healthcare Organization, the United Nations, the OECD, the World Bank, etc., gather information about countries and how they investigate independently whether that information is accurate and whether that information is positive. I'm not a buyer of the conspiracy theory that we read in some places, but I definitely believe that if the international community had at least acted with the same level of suspicion or preemptive action that, again, coming back, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore acted on, then everything would have been a lot different than what we're seeing today. Absolutely.
Yeah, it just seems to us a bit like, again, a failure of centralization, right? I mean, if the WHO has one job, the World Health Organization, they get billions a year to exactly protect us in this case of like a global pandemic. It pretty much fails, right? So that's like a pretty bad investment. You know, guys, you had 60 years or 70 years and billions to prepare for this one thing. And like a country like Taiwan, which is not recognized by them, figured it out early and was not listened, like no one listened to them. So that's interesting. So your book, Freedom or Equality, concludes with several points, but the point I love the most is to strengthening the middle class, building up a more robust and strong middle class as a response to this. There's always a growing gap between rich and poor. Let's just make more people rich. Basically, I think we're coming to the end of this webinar, but what would be like your general statement? How can we strengthen the middle class in light of everything that just happened? And what are the best next steps?
The first one is if we want to rebuild the middle class, what we need to do is to base our economic system on prudent savings and investment, not on debt and expenses. The second thing is that we cannot continue to use monster monetary policy, huge increases of money supply and cutting rates that hurt the middle class the most, because those are the savers. Savers are hugely hit because of this situation. Second thing, so monetary policy is important. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is very important. Monetary policy on one side erodes the savings and the real wages of the middle class, while fiscal policy with the trick of we're only going to tax the rich, the middle class consistently and constantly gets higher taxes. We're going to see it in the very near future. And they will lie again about the idea of raising taxes to the rich, because numbers don't add up. You don't get hundreds of thousands of billions of deficit paid by 2,000, 3,000 people. You know? Exaggerating a little bit here. But so the point is fiscal and the point is monetary. And we need to return to an economic system that sees that saving is good, that sees that prudent investment is not driven by low interest rates and massive liquidity, but by good projects with good returns on weighted average cost of capital. So all in all, it's basically stopping this monster transfer of wealth from the middle class to governments. And that would definitely strengthen the position of those people in the middle class.
That's great. We should stop the transfer of wealth from the middle class to governments. That's a great closing statement. Daniel Lacalle, with his new book, Freedom or Equality, I encourage everyone to buy it on Amazon or your Kindle store, wherever you consume books, read it. And Daniel, thank you so much for joining us here at the Consumer Choice Center's webinar series. We love your work. Thank you for promoting such a smart fiscal, monetary, and consumer policy approach across the world. Pleasure talking to you, and enjoy your rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Excuse the connection problems. I hope that we will have further conversations like this. It's been fantastic. Great questions. Have a great day and keep defending freedom. Thank you so much.